Welcome, my dear friends and colleagues from across the globe. Thank you for joining me. My name is Tim Mikhelishvili. I'm going to be your host, also CEO, co-founder of Amadea Pharma, an analytics and management consulting company that helps pharma and medical device organizations inspire and measure their team performance and engagement using modern proprietary platforms and communications playbooks that are based purely on sportsmanship, which they honor, and also and reward, as well as the scientific thinking. A little bit about me. I work in the pharmaceutical industry for about 18 years now, and I started in medical education and publications before moving into field medical affairs role in the medical division of the pharmaceutical industry. And in training roles, as well as various different therapeutic areas, both global startup companies as well. Now, I came into the industry with the intention of adding new ideas and continuing to identify gaps, even though I didn't have any formal basic science research training. And so I brought these ideas to my teams regardless of whether or not they were implemented, how popular they were, or how they were perceived. And throughout the course of most of my career, I developed lots of important relationships with critical scientific and thought leaders in healthcare and clinicians in medicine as well, from whom I learned and whom I taught as well, and whom I connected to company educational as well as research and clinical activities. So that's been my role for most of my career. Now, with Amadea Pharma, my mission is to really help companies generate innovation, quality, and continuity in healthcare. Because in this very competitive environment in healthcare, and in business world, I think we need to design those contests that matter, that can help us quantify and combine both technical performance with engagement or with behaviors, using some of the tactics and strategies that you'll find at Amadea Pharma. So I invite you to visit the Amadea Pharma website, and also I have a presentation today here that I'm excited about sharing with you. Because I think that it'll spark some new ideas in how you can design different contests and different ways to show and grow your team's value. So my email is on the ticket right here on the bottom, timmick@amadeapharma.com. So if you have some interests or questions, and would like to continue and build on this conversation, please, I urge you to contact me. Now, today I'm going to be presenting an encore discussion that I had a chance to share already with many of my colleagues and leaders across the pharmaceutical industry in Philadelphia at the second annual Medical Affairs Digital Transformation Summit. I really enjoyed sharing and exchanging ideas, and I'm going to start by making a confession here that I'm a proud owner of the latest BlackBerry, which runs on the Android system. And it's not because I'm seeking attention and I want to be different, but it's because of the context that its use has for me. The keyboard decreases the distance from me to the phone. I make less errors using the phone, and also trains my muscle memory. And believe it or not, there is a community, a loyal community of us, BlackBerry users. It's in the thousands, it's not in the millions. However, that's really the reason for really describing what deep metrics really can do. how they can take us from increasing our our attention and getting that attention to grabbing more share of context and also building a community. And that's really the three parts of this presentation that I'm going to take you through this journey and help you hopefully understand how we can first use those metrics to describe in our activities, our teams, its value, using those concrete ways and communications through by grabbing that attention. But then also, I'm going to challenge you to think about how you can utilize metrics to also grab a larger share of context and again build a community. So I want to ask you to share your comments here. I'm live on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. Even though I use a BlackBerry. So there is, of course, a particular transformation that I've gone through. But also, I challenge how I use the technology and different modalities with which to connect with people. And clearly, I've already presented this discussion to my colleagues, but I'm using multiple channels and different ways to communicate in order to reach a wider audience and to get more attention, of course. And that's going to be the first step, right? And first part we'll be discussing. And so make sure to comment. I'll look at the comments periodically, and I'll also address your questions at the end of the presentation. Grabbing more attention using metrics is probably one of the first goals. And the best way to do that is probably to challenge and change the ways we communicate information, how we collaborate and communicate. And so take a look at this image first. It's intended to grab your attention because it represents innovation in mobility. A self-driving car without a steering wheel that interprets terabytes of data in every millisecond on the physical objects in the immediate vicinity, traffic, traction of the tires, the weather, in order to take over the control of the wheel and to prevent unnecessary accidents and to save lives. Well, in reality, the technology has been here for quite a few years now, but it's not always accurate. I tested it myself on one car manufacturer, which I will not name. However, it didn't work more than about 3/4 of the time, about 75% of the time. So what does this have to do with the medical division of the pharmaceutical industry, you may ask? Well, it's really pictures and images such as this that we use in order to communicate our metrics and the value of our teams as well as our activities. And we don't often communicate all of our actionable insights, business insights that we bring into the organization or our activities because of fear of how they may be perceived by our colleagues, our different functions, and because we ultimately succumb to the notion that perception is reality. And so the way that plays out in the real world is that we ultimately end up not reacting to reality as it unfolds, and we communicate misperceptions sometimes. And reality is more exposed today by data than ever before. So perception is no longer reality. There's just too many different metrics and technologies and tools that expose it. And so we run the risk of increasing liability to companies by not exposing reality, and which can translate in lives, patient lives. And also we don't communicate our value fully in a manner that's consistent with the activities that the accomplishments that we merit to share with our teammates across the organization. One of the reasons why we have fragmented communication standards today, and for many years probably, in pharma and medical devices is because of the firewall in the restrictions that we ourselves have created for how we can communicate from medical to commercial. But we fail to really to understand through the policies that we create ourselves that we ultimately converge in this continuum of healthcare in medical. MSLs that you see there on the right, or medical science liaisons, help physicians identify the suitable patients for medications, for devices, whereas our commercial counterparts help them ultimately get the access, because they cannot confer benefit from their treatments if they don't have access to the treatments as well. So we ultimately converge in this continuum of healthcare, but we do not often communicate readily enough all of the information that is relevant to the reality that unfolds in front of us. The metrics that we ourselves create and design have an important and integral role in how we communicate and how the level to which we are engaged in our jobs, in our roles. And this is something that we have to probably take into consideration, because regardless of our background, our experience, our age, whether or not we're 5 years old or we're 85, we all seek attention. And metrics is one way to bring that attention, the right kind of attention, through the recognition of our efforts, right? Of the fact that we are present and we engage in the activities and creating opportunities for our organizations. And so these are attention and recognition are both intimately connected to the metrics that we design ourselves. Now, the engagement in the workplace is a function of the culture that we create. And if you take a step outside of medical affairs and the pharma industry, and revisit these three leaders, important, accomplished leaders such as Bill Gore, Paul Pullman, and James Rhee, whom I've featured in the In Weekend Journal on LinkedIn, you'll see that all of them drastically changed the norms of communication. And that's why norm changing and updating how you communicate and collaborate is probably the first step in getting that attention. Bill Gore at W.L. Gore Associates, an electronic signal transmission company and high-performance fabrics company that has been around for 6 decades now, he required every employee to rank 20 to 30 other employees. And he paired every employee with a sponsor who was incentivized based on the success of that new hire, whom they trained and whom they mentored. So that changed how how people collaborated. They featured metrics, but they also updated the norms of communication. And the company has reported annual gains and has never reported an annual loss for over 6 decades. Paul Pullman came into Unilever, a consumer goods company, a global consumer goods company, and he decreased the numbers of intersections between departments, decreased the levels of hierarchies from 11 to 5. And James Rhee came into Ashley Stewart, a failing company that was barely able to keep up its inventory, that was not in sanitary conditions even, and he allowed his employees to share and promote their stores, their local stores, using their personal accounts, using their personal social media accounts, and all three of them turned around their companies drastically. Okay. The McKinsey data from years ago demonstrates a big difference between the level of engagement among business owners and those who are in the frontline employees. That difference is about 70% based on this survey in 2020 that was shared by Gary Hamel and Michele Zanini on the Human Movement podcast. This difference, I think, underlines how how important engagement is as a target, and how we need to change our communication in pharma and beyond. And so what we've noticed is that post-pandemic, there's also a difference in what types of employees are more likely to go back to the home office. Usually, it's the business owners, the executives, who are excited about going back to the office, but not as many frontline employees who are asking for more work flexibility. And so, I know that many of us will watching this probably will say that, look, we've learned how to be more productive working remotely. And there's plenty of data that had shown that even before the pandemic. And it's because of the productivity that people want to be flexible. Well, my argument and a question here to you is really that, does that really answer this question completely? It may not be addressing an underlying root cause for why, another reason for why people are not going back to the home office. If business owners have company culture values, and they regard their employees as family members, right? Wouldn't you, as a family member, then run back to the home office to be with your family, to hug them and to work with them as soon as the restrictions were lifted? That didn't happen, as 2/3 of the employees in general, and most of them frontline employees, have chosen to stay and work remotely. So it's the great revelation that this data may show is that it's not just that we're being more productive working remotely, but we may not be included. Our voices may not be heard, right? And as a consequence, we may not be as engaged in our work. In addition to the impact that metrics have on our engagement levels, let's examine how those KPIs, key performance indicators, and the metrics that we design impact our workflow, because our workflow in turn also influences the outcomes, the expectations, the strategy that we design as well, the goals that we set. So, and this is just a hypothetical example in these two pie charts that you see that demonstrate that if you spend more time capturing your activities or planning them rather than executing them, then maybe you need to revisit them. Maybe you need to increase the extent to which you communicate your activities more widely, and use novel tools that help you capture the information faster. And that way you can spend maybe up to 50% of your workflow in those activities that matter. And so in order to really understand how productive we were during that transition in our remote, flexible work environments that the pandemic really introduced us to, I studied the presence of the virtual productivity threshold by surveying many of my colleagues in medical affairs across the globe. And I asked them to take a look at their daily meetings, because we go from one virtual meeting to the other, to the next. And I wanted to measure the self-reported productivity and deep uninterrupted work. So I received 271 responses. I presented this data at the DIA Global Meeting just recently in June in Chicago. And what our responses showed was that there was a significant relationship between both the number of virtual meetings and the break time intervals between them and our self-reported deep uninterrupted work. And those who engaged in less than 3 virtual meetings per day spend 50% longer in deep uninterrupted work compared to those that went from one meeting to the next and had more than 3 meetings. So the question that we need to ask ourselves now is not only are we being more productive, but are we being more creative using multiple channels of communication, virtual, digital channels, social media, podcasts. And that's the question that a recent article in Nature explored. It was an intricate study, both a field and a lab experiment that tracked eye movements of those involved in virtual meetings, and they recorded their conversations as well in pairs. And it demonstrated that in-person meetings may increase our creativity, that virtual meetings cause us to focus our eyes on each other, interrupt each other less, disagree less, and the idea divergence as measured by forward flow of ideas or a lack of semantic similarity, which is denoted by the top part of the graph you see on the right side, those dots, most of which that space is taken by in-person meetings, meaning they had a more forward flow of ideas or ideas that really diverged from each other, weren't in the same vein. But it's not really the modality, but it may be the expectations that we have from virtual meetings. What this means to us is that maybe we don't need to require everyone to be on video all the time. Maybe we need to decrease the number of virtual meetings we have. There's data from a quiet time experiment and Leslie Perrell, who demonstrated that quiet time 3 days of the week actually demonstrated a 67% increase in productivity, right? And in fact, in this study in Nature, we learned that the virtual meetings actually increased decision quality. So while it has some weaknesses, there's also some strengths. It's just how you utilize the modality, whether it's a LinkedIn Live, YouTube, or whether it's a BlackBerry. Okay. One of the most valuable pieces of information that we communicate in medical affairs is the insights. Okay. And the insights are generally defined very loosely as those moments, those aha moments that we immediately recognize. We know what those insights are. It's clear. However, sometimes that leads to an increased noise to signal ratio where we define everything as insights. And so a more specific definition was one that we brainstormed at one startup a few years ago that divided the insights into 3 domains: investigational use, a real-world experience after a product or a treatment is launched, for example, as well as unpublished intelligence that may be related to disease, treatment guidelines, for example, or different transitions of academic thought leaders or clinicians, for example. In the effort to increase the proportion of signals versus noise, and to generate those more actionable insights that we can react to and respond to. So the problem, however, in the last 4 companies in which I've worked and I've instituted the insights process is that from the time that you generate those insights from a conversation or your review of the literature to the time that you capture it and you communicate it with your colleagues, there's a delay. And that delay leads to a recall bias and decreased context of that information. And so similar to the unfortunate accident of the Boeing, what happened in which a disaster in manufacturing was never really communicated to management. And by the time that they knew about it, it became an accomplishment, right? Or that insight became small or even non-existent. And it led to hundreds of lives that were lost. Okay. So there is an important, urgency in sharing these insights in real time. In fact, there's data that has been shared before that demonstrates that in medical affairs, about three quarters of all medical science liaisons, those who engage with scientific thought leaders and engage them in company activities and research activities, that 75% do not know whether or not those actionable insights that they have captured and communicated were ever followed up by their management. Okay, so, and those are the misperceptions, and the perception is reality, that the principles that cause often those insights to never really be shared, and they have dire consequences sometimes. So going from that lag time, from this gap, this lag time, and what if you were to decrease that lag time and you were to capture that insight earlier, and then you would shorten that lag time from capture to communication, or from generation to capture as well. Well, you may transform those insights, and those insights that are continuing to be at the top of minds of many different partners of yours across the organization. In one webinar that I partnered with a company called Sorcero, whom I advise, an NLP, natural language processing company, an advanced analytics company, we presented a proof of principle concept in which insights are shared via smartphone. So how you share those insights and how you communicate, what tools do you use, can also play a very important role in demonstrating, in grabbing that attention from the partners that you need, externally and internally. Jeff New, who's Director of Operations and Medical Excellence at Novartis Gene Therapy, who's I believe is attending this session here today, he refers to this as treating medical insights or business insights as an IT ticket, right? In which you share them in real time via smartphone, for example, that's tied to a CRM or customer relationship management tool that you have, and that gets validated by someone else, a decision maker in your company, in your function or outside of your function, which ultimately allows you to spend more time in activity and change your workflow by how you communicate, the tools that you communicate. You are able to meet with more physicians, go out there in the field, and visit them in their hospitals. Not all interactions will lead to insights, and not all insights will lead to sentiment. Not all of those sentiments, even a smaller proportion, demonstrates actionable insights that your company can generate or disseminate some data about. And so this is a diagram that I created to provide the perspective of where each of these different types of information should fall, and how you can filter it using those definitions, those three domains, and then have additional multiple filters of information, and maybe potentially implement metrics that describe the ratio of insights to interactions, or what is the percentage of interactions that demonstrate sentiment analysis? What is the percentage of insights that demonstrate sentiment? In my experience so far, leading some of these processes in 4 companies, that percentage is about 16 to 17%. About 1 in 5 interactions leads to an insight. I don't have any data on how the proportion of insights that demonstrate sentiment, or how a particular decision maker, clinician, or scientist may feel about your treatment, and that can be another metric that you can think about. But in the dashboards that you have in medical affairs, you often limit yourself in the level of detail that we share. And it's really in that level of detail where action takes place. And that's why just categorizing sentiment as positive, neutral, or negative may not be enough. You may have to filter the type of sentiment into whether or not whether or not a customer, a stakeholder, a payer, or a physician feels like they need more data. This data or this product needs more improvement, needs an alternative, for example. All right, and this way, an executive in medical or in one of your partners in commercial or other decision makers, what they can do is they can quickly filter through that data using a tool that or an instrument that you have, a communication platform, and they can go into those details very quickly rather than having to sift through multiple sources of Excel spreadsheets, PowerPoints, emails, right? And so those are some of the different approaches. Now, 4 years ago, in one failing startup company that had a next generation product and that was competing against the market leader, medical affairs conducted a gap analysis of the literature. And we identified some flaws in the very reputable review papers in our field. And we presented a potential study, a comparative post hoc review of all phase 3 data of our product and the competitor, which had a lot of direct-to-consumer funding, which was all over the TV. And the data that we generated resulted in late-breaking abstract, which was presented that we co-authored along with a global thought leader, and that was recognized by Bloomberg, by Seeking Alpha. We had our commercial executives in marketing as well and in sales who are monitoring the reception to the late-breaking abstract. And they were able to confirm that this medical affairs led initiative and late-breaking abstract increased the shareholder value and increased the business by $40 million throughout the course of those 4 hours of that presentation. So I shared this at the second annual Medical Affairs Digital Transformation Summit, and I told people that, look, medical affairs helped a company generate or increase its valuation by $40 million directly. And you're going to cringe when I say that. I told the audience, and I'm going to tell you, the same audience here as well, because medical affairs is not tasked with generating revenue directly. We're there to educate healthcare professionals and all the external stakeholders, as well as internal stakeholders, in order to make sure that we bring safer and more effective medications and that they're used appropriately. The right patient receives it at the right time, right? However, we need to demonstrate the direct impact in some ways that are tangible, that can help us communicate the reality better. Because the reality is that we are contributing. This is a division that many people don't know about, that contributes and that generates important critical data. And so for me, for what was even more striking and more impressive and more memorable, I would say, 4 years ago, was that those late-breaking abstracts, more than the direct impact it had on the business, they re-energized the entire company. We received emails from the sales, from commercials, saying, thank you. We did national sales training, and in addition to helping use different types of even messaging that medical affairs led, that ultimately led to thousands of patients receiving access to this medication, which only had one adverse event in its label. We were able to change how we communicated the information also, and what type of information we communicated. Because I posted this abstract on LinkedIn, which was questioned by our management. And in the last Christmas party that I attended, our partners in sales had invited us, and they had told us that each one of them had gotten up in our absence, in medical affairs' absence, to defend why we posted that on LinkedIn. Okay, and late-breaking abstract that we ourselves co-authored, and they defended us because they knew that we had their best interests. So it was a very turning point in how we communicated with each other and how we collaborated across the organization. Now, I bring up a lot of controversial topics here today in this presentation in order to really understand how to stay relevant with our environment. And our restrictions often that we create ourselves in how we communicate can pose a problem. After I left that company and I went to the next one, I influenced our leadership to update their social media communications policies. And recently, I had a chance to talk to Darshan Kulkarni, who's an expert in this space, who advises many pharmaceutical companies. And he shared data with me that demonstrates that the FDA really doesn't have a clear position on off-label discussions. And that the number of warning letters that the FDA, DDMAC, or the OPDP, Office of Prescription Drug Promotion, had sent to pharmaceutical companies or medical device companies has decreased substantially. And there's even more recent data that was just published by Philip Reveal at the DIA meeting in June in Chicago that showed a 78% lower number of letters. So the takeaway here in the lesson is not that we need to neglect those restrictions and compliance policies and FDA, but we need to take and update our position, but take some stance and change it in order to be able to have more fluid communication together. That's one way to increase the attention that our companies, our teams, our individuals receive in medical and beyond. So if in an analogy with social media, for example, I mentioned that I'm doing an encore presentation here, a more detailed presentation across LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook to get attention. So in that, it's the attention can be thought of as receiving likes in social media, right? You receive likes for various different reasons. It may be because somebody genuinely supports you, supports the post, or just supports you, or somebody feels like they want something in return, but you don't know what that context is of that like. Well, metrics are a good way to get attention, but now let's talk about how to get to grab your share of context, right? Not just by improving your communications, but also by designing metrics that inspire future behaviors rather than past activities alone. All right, and so this is the strategy by which you can increase the context, increase your share of context by, again, communicating the activities and outcomes that matter, that are more meaningful to you and your companies. So in the last webinar that I led, I surveyed the audience, the global audience, and it turns out that only 5% of global medical affairs colleagues feel that the metrics are meaningful in their organization. 75% feel like they're somewhat meaningful, which leaves a lot of information, a lot to interpretation, and a lot to be desired. I think a lot more to be desired, and so this is why I think that when you have any database, any system, or any contest that you're designing, you have to consider this metrics management cycle, which is a continuous, and which starts with consistent definitions and input. This is the data integrity. This is making sure that everyone's clear on the activities that they capture in their CRM, for example, in their customer relationship management tool, in order to make sure that the information is valid, is relevant. Then the next step is to make sure that you regularly and frequently communicate and capture that information, because the more data over time, the more that you collect, the more predictable your activities are. And finally, you have to be able to follow through across the entire metrics management cycle and validate whether or not your activities are ultimately leading to a change in behavior, because that's the data translation. So 3 steps again: data relevance, data predictability, and then data translation in the Amadea Pharma terms. Okay. Now, ultimately, it doesn't stop there, because once you reach that goal and you demonstrate patient and physician outcomes in behavior, you need to then revise and understand how you can then maybe introduce new metrics, and the cycle continues. So when when you measure different activities, you need to be able to trace them to the outcomes across this path. And I thought about the best way to visualize this, and it's really a path that we are on. To show that, look, if we are measuring a department that is involved in developing relationships, but we measure that by keystrokes, by monitoring keystrokes, that may not be a relevant measure for that function. It may be more relevant for someone who's working in a call center, who have to be in front of their computer at all times. But if you're expecting relationships to form and communities to form, the metrics should also mirror your expectations, right? And they need to. You have 3 different levels of metric. So if you're measuring somebody in medical affairs who's developed relationships like an MSL by keystrokes alone, if you're monitoring them that way, because the data is there, you can utilize the data. As I mentioned, there's so many tools that you can use, and endless metrics that you can come up with. That's a level 1 metric, which means it's not really on the path of describing the relationship between the activities and the outcomes, because that's how I define metrics, as an estimate of the relationship between activities and the desired outcomes. And there's more recent literature now that's demonstrating that when employees know that they're monitored, they're more likely to do exactly that type of behavior that's not welcomed, because the sheer knowledge of being monitored is kind of like the same response you get from children whom you want to learn, and you tell them, hey, you have to learn this, but you need to gamify it, create a game, design a particular contest in order for them to comply, and not only comply, but to be inspired to contribute and participate in that contest. And that's why you have to be very careful about how you choose the metrics, how you design those metrics. So level 1 metric is one that's denoted by an X that doesn't fall along these dashed the dotted lines, right? The dashed lines. Level 2 metric means that it is relevant. It's relevant, and it may be predictable, meaning that the metric that you're using accurately describes the activities. However, if it's not followed through, it's to an outcome, then there's a question mark. And so level 2 metrics are those with the question marks here on this graph. Meaning that if you, for example, demonstrate that you have 15 publications as a company at a particular congress, a scientific conference, that's a good metric for a publications department, or that may be a good indicator of activity of data generation. If you're measuring, if that's part of your strategy to generate particular data in one of your medical strategic drivers on efficacy, or let's say efficacy safety ratio, or maybe building the awareness of the unmet burden of disease. However, it doesn't really demonstrate a change in practice. How that publication leads to a change in practice. So that's why you need to take a deeper approach to those metrics, and maybe consider level 3 metrics by following up with those attendees at that conference, who may have attended that medical education program, or who may have seen that poster or that publication, and surveying them to understand whether or not they've changed their practice and behavior. And those are the ones that are the level 3 metrics, where it's not just a correlation between an activity and the metric, and a possible correlation between an outcome and activity, but it's a causation. Causation in data science terms is defined as an event that takes an activity that precedes an outcome. So it has to occur chronologically, it has to precede an outcome, and it cannot be explained by anything else, any other cause. All right, so there's a direct relationship there between your activity and your outcome. So that's known as prescriptive analytics in the data science terms, and in Amadea Pharma terms, I refer to that as data translation, right, or a level 3 metric. When we design clinical trials, we come up with different endpoints. These endpoints allow us to translate abstract concepts such as pain into validated scores, right? So we validate those scores, and we come up with different clinical endpoints, and we design those those trials. And so in a similar way, we have to think of metrics as designing a contest. And the reason why I've pictured a high jump here is because high jump is an example of a type of competition that honors, that rewards sportsmanship to the same degree as behaviors, right? And sportsmanship as performance, right? So it rewards sportsmanship and performance equally. And so, in fact, for years, for decades, in the high jump, there hasn't been a world record because using performance enhancing substances does not confer an advantage in a high jump, unlike in a 100-meter dash, for example, right? And so what that means is that in medical affairs, we need to create the types of contests where those who participate, who are directly influenced by those metrics, know who the players are, what the endpoints are, who the judges are, and those judges have to be from various different directions, up, down, and across the organization, with audiences, and they have to know about the rules before they engage in those activities. But otherwise, what happens is there are people who are high-performing individuals in medical, in pharma, across different industries, but they're cynics. They become cynics because they don't believe in the metrics. They don't believe that the metrics are relevant to their activities or to their outcomes. So, and when there is a lack of clarity in presenting those metrics, what happens is you're given a contest where you're asked to run a 100-meter dash, but you don't know where the finish line is. Okay. The gap in the metrics research in medical affairs, I think, also has a lot to do with the fact that most of them are externally facing. We report metrics as absolute numbers, right? And we don't follow them enough over time. Number of attendees, number of publications are great and common external metrics, but we don't often measure whether or not and how long or how the extent to which we learn and we teach each other, because training each other ultimately also leads to important business outcomes directly, right? And so, and even to a lesser degree, or do we ever really communicate what types of metrics translate into which types of awards? What are the criteria that can lead to one employee being more likely to receive an award, to receive a promotion than others? And when you don't have those rules in place, you have people again who are not as engaged, and who don't demonstrate the same quality of work that's consistent to their potential. That's the reality that we have to face in pharma, in medical affairs, and across the business world. Okay, so it's the argument here is that it's not that metrics mean more competition, but it's the wrong metrics or lack thereof that may increase competition instead, in the wrong type of unhealthy competition. The perspectives here are very different that we choose when we design metrics. They start usually with the company in mind. You have to make sure that the division has the staff, has the profit, has profitability, it has the revenue coming in. You have to make sure that medications or treatments are accessible, right? By payees, you have a payee strategy. You have make them available to those who don't have insurance, to the government, to Medicaid, right? To the elderly. So this diagram here depicts the relative attention that we pay to, or the relative weight that these different perspectives have. And we usually think from a company perspective first, because we need to make sure that company keeps running. Well, what if we were to change those perspectives when we design those metrics also? If we start from the patient, then we make sure that make sure that they receive those medications, payees next, and then the government, right, for those who don't have insurance, and then we think about that employee experience. How can we increase the employee engagement, and then education of the KOLs, and with the company having a smaller perspective than is usual and is customary, we may be able to deliver even stronger results. Okay, so and very importantly, as the product matures over time, during the drug development process, there is a metamorphosis of the metrics. It's a moving target. It's a constantly moving target in this competitive and volatile dynamic environment, and that's why we need to revisit those metrics constantly, train on how to design the metrics that matter, that are meaningful, and be able to study ourselves, study both those leading and lagging indicators or metrics, what I call in more scientific terms, the prospective measurements of activities and retrospective outcomes, meaning that all of our activities are measured prospectively. Are the metrics, the goals that we set early on in the year. Then after the activities or during the activities, we capture them as close as possible to the activity, and we analyze them. But we make an important distinction between activities and outcomes. Outcomes in the orange here, because those outcomes and how we define outcomes is often unclear. We often use both activities and outcomes interchangeably. Publications may not be an outcome for the pharmacovigilance group, for example, or even for field medical affairs. For field medical affairs, it may be very different. It may be the awareness of the product, right? Product awareness. And this is why they have to be diverse. And in my experience working at both large, global, small, rare disease companies, I've seen many different approaches to metrics in medical affairs. Those that had diverse, transparent communication of metrics, and many of them, and that thrived on metrics, just like those three leaders that I showed early in those companies, to me, they were able to grow faster and become leaders in their space. For example, Salix Pharmaceuticals, which became the largest GI company in the world that I had the pleasure of working for. So I talked a little bit in the beginning about platforms, proprietary platforms that you can, or frameworks that you can use in order to communicate, show, and grow your team's performance and engagement. Well, it really started from my observations of very competitive and collaborative teams, such as the one that I mentioned in that failing startup case scenario, that Christmas party, right? These sales reps, they were very competitive. They knew where they stood. They ranked each other all the time, but they were collaborative. And when it mattered, they defended and they collaborated. They supported medical affairs, which really is the opposite of what the wrong metrics or the lack of metrics can do. When the metrics are very different from one function to another, and when they're not communicated transparently, there can be interdepartmental rivalries that are unnecessary, that are unneeded, and inappropriate recording of activities as well in your CRM database. And this is why I came up with the Medical Productivity Index, which values performance and behavior equally at 50% each. And I wrote about it 3 years ago in an article, in a LinkedIn article that captured a lot of attention, as a result of which I started to consult companies like Sorcero, for example. And what this MPI offers is a rank-ordered list of activities by impact that are communicated transparently, and that are also a composite of both activities as well as the feedback from internal functional and cross-functional colleagues who are most directly influenced by those activities from the employees, as well as external stakeholders. And so you receive both internal and external feedback that's more balanced, up, down, across the organization internally. And you also keep track of those retrospective outcomes on a regular basis. As those outcomes occur, whether or not they occur in 1 month or in 1 year and 2 years, as was the case in our late-breaking abstract, for example, took us 2 years to reach those results, even though it probably could have taken us 3 months. Right? It was called waste of time. We had to spend a lot of time convincing our internal stakeholders and partners. However, it's very important to measure those outcomes as well, qualitatively. What's another distinction of the MPI is that it assigns numerical values to all activities. So it expresses them as ranked numerical values by impact. All right. So there's total MSL points in the field medical affairs scenario. All of the components are on this slide here, as you can see. The internal feedback is collected via 1-minute surveys that have no open-ended text, so they're data-based. So this is a very objective approach, as objective as possible, and that also they're expressed numerically, both internal surveys and external KOL surveys that are conducted by third parties. This is an Excel spreadsheet because we piloted this before. So I had the chance to pilot this presented at my previous company. And we identified this as MemSL performance points, again, which can be normalized. They can be normalized over the course of the year based on, let's say, the top performer or the maximum, or either the highest level or at an arbitrary number, such as 1,000 points at the end of the year, for example, that you can normalize to 50. And you can also average all the surveys and create a maximum score of 50, for example. So to give you an example of how different activities are ranked, an interaction may be a reference and a type of activity that may be assigned 1 point, whereas an insight may be assigned 4 points. A publication, authorship of a publication or a late-breaking abstract, for example, could be 10 points for you, right? And so over time, what you are able to do is you measure the activities, their relative impact, and you can also measure the same type of activities over time. You can assign different numerical values at a particular given time intervals, or standardize them, or maybe have very individual types of scoring assignments that may vary based on geography. Right? You may have assigned different types of points. You can choose the strategy you want to use, but however, the point here is that you express them numerically in some way that is easier to understand, that is more clear, and also to demonstrate to your partners. We also defined outcomes. Outcomes are these abstract concepts that for which we all have different definitions, but at least having a definition is a first start. Right? And we defined them, and when we piloted them, as any routine, recurrent, or on-demand activity that involves teaching or learning information with an internal or external stakeholder that leads to a change in strategy or behavior. So there has to be learning or teaching rather than just activity. There has to be learning and teaching, internal and external stakeholder, based on recurrent, right, on-demand or routine types of activities. And we kept these on a monthly basis in a separate spreadsheet, simple spreadsheet. And what that did was it helped us significantly decrease the performance review time, all right? Because the time that we spent in the performance reviews, again, is part of our workflow. And usually it's the dreaded time of the year when people engage in that performance review process. It's so time consuming that it probably takes more work and time than the actual activities, right? And so you want to eliminate that. The internal performance surveys, there are questions and how you phrase them that are going to determine the value of the feedback that you get, the outcomes. And so I've thought about them in detail. I've presented them as a part of the Medical Affairs Metrics workbook that you can contact me as well about. So in this internal performance survey, you assess the perception of your colleagues, both in the medical, in commercial as well, or all of those that you designate who are directly impacted by the work of the person you're evaluating, to see whether or not they feel like the employee the medical science liaison has in-depth knowledge of their territory, their product, the disease state, and is also able to be resourceful and utilizing all the tools necessary in a timely manner. The external performance surveys are shorter. Notice that they're five questions, and you can coordinate them across medical as well as field sales. And these demonstrate the extent to which your physicians, your researchers, feel like they would recommend you to their colleagues, to their peers. How clearly you communicate, and timely that communication is, not just how accurate it is. Then you have the second half of the MPI, which is an important component, which we rarely measure. In that same webinar, a minority, of our attendees responded to say that they evaluate or they include engagement or culture in their metrics, which I think is an opportunity and a gap. So in the MPI includes 50% of the total score as behavior. Right? Again, external surveys and internal surveys that make up these behavior components of the MPI score, and the internal colleagues can weigh in on the extent to which they feel like the employee is likely to change their opinion, to acknowledge their other colleagues, and to do work because they believe in the work rather than because of the optics or because of the reward they have. External behavior surveys from physicians, for example, or investigators here are very interesting and important here because they're 5, and you need to ask those right questions. And so some of these may include the perception to which they feel like they're respected by the pharma employee as not just a thought leader, key opinion leader, but as an individual and as a peer HCP. and the extent to which also, number 5 here, for example, that the MSL's presence, medical science liaison's presence, limits the comfort level in which for them to share unbiased information. And notice that they're bidirectional. And the numbers you see here are numerical values that can be added and averaged. So that last question, right, the comfort level of the external stakeholders is an important one, because it ultimately implies whether or not the insights that your teams share are biased, right? Because if and that's the reason why I believe that it should be a third party that should collect these surveys and this data. So ultimately, what does this MPI lead to? Well, it leads to transparent communication of metrics, and a hypothetical scenario, again, in which someone who's a high performer technically, yet who does not engage and collaborate well with their colleagues, knows at the end of the first quarter very transparently that they don't rank first, they rank second. And they rank second because this is how they're perceived by their colleagues and by their external stakeholders through this composite score. And that's why they have a focus to improve their behavior and how they come across for the second quarter. So they know where they stand early, and they can change that behavior later, right, in a timely manner. Whereas performance reviews are usually done once a year or twice a year, they may not be enough, because it's really in that feedback that we get that share of context. Those likes in the social media only grab our attention, right? Only are an estimate of the attention that we get. But the comments that you're going to share here as well, is what's going to determine the feedback of what you think is relevant here in this presentation, right? And that's what we all seek, as I mentioned earlier. The advantages of the MPI are, again, to quantify and gamify activities and as well as outcomes transparently. Distribute that accountability for internal and external metrics more evenly, right? Similar to Bill Gore and the W.L. Gore Associates example, where he forced every single employee to rank 20 to 30 other employees in a company that had no hierarchy, only had the CEO and the employees. Flat, lean company, but that nevertheless leveraged metrics. And it asked them to rank each other based on one criterion, which was the extent to which they felt that that employee led to the success and benefit of that company, the success of that company. And so similarly here, the MPI is structured in a way, is designed in a way to distribute that accountability more evenly than is commonly done, or that has ever been attempted before. And then ultimately it rewards performance and behavior equally in every single medical affairs function. So while most of you may think, many of you probably may think that, look, this requires a lot of work, in our pilot, because we had this framework in place, we knew what the outcomes meant. We were capturing those outcomes. We saved a lot of time afterwards. So more design up front means a lot of time savings down the road, and a simpler process downstream. And so by avoiding metrics, we perpetuate this dreaded process that we can eliminate using more transparent, more real-time and fluid assessment and feedback on our behaviors from various different directions, right? And so we can really transform that dreaded performance review process into a taboo, into a treasure. We can transform that taboo into a treasure by using data and metrics that can inspire future behaviors. So very often I get the question of, look, the MPI is a good case study in field medical affairs where you've spent most of your time. How does it work in other areas of medical affairs? Well, in medical education, for example, there is a very detailed systematic analysis of all social media delivered medical education programs and the metrics that are reported. And in this set of about 600 different studies, about a third of them reported metrics, first of all, about 192, and most of which only communicate the metrics that we already know, that we can expect, that they're accepted, that social media is an accepted format for delivering medical education. But only 2 and 3% of these metrics that have been reported actually communicate the behavioral change or organizational patient outcomes, which is an important gap in the medical education, in the social medical education metrics. And so I think that there's a new approach that we need in medical education. And when we study this return on education and social media, you're tuning in right now to maybe pick up a few ideas, right? And to maybe share them as well. So we're learning and teaching in this session. And so while, a view may be defined as 3 seconds, what can you really learn in 3 seconds? Yeah, if you're capturing that metric, yeah, you have hundreds of attendees and maybe 50 views, right? But what learning and teaching really takes place? That's what you need to ask yourself. And this is why that new return on education in social media should not just assess the intent to change or behavior, but also it should validate it, and it should be implemented at multiple time points. Continuous metrics are continuous. They should not be an episode. And there should be various different surveys and formats. Right? What percentage of the session did somebody watch over your educational program? Did they just advance to the post-test very quickly? What did they really learn? And if they said that they intended to change their practice, did you really follow up afterwards? And this is why I shared this metric case study from medical education program that has a before and after type of intervention and outcomes, and shows first what are the most important or more relevant patient conditions or procedures that are being planned, right? If there's a surgical program, for example, surgical medical education program, you ask those attendees, that the attendees after the program, let's say 1 month, 2 months down the line, at the beginning of their day of cases, and you ask them what kinds of patients are they going to see, what is being planned, what are the relevant resources, and whether or not they recall this particular educational program, for which you're trying to look for metrics. That inspires those attendees to revisit that educational program, and maybe apply it in their cases when they see patients. And so afterwards, when you follow up at the end of the day or at the end of the week, what you can do is you can then assess what were the key variables in their decision making, what were the references they used, and then how did this educational program impact your decisions? What is the percentage of the relevant cases of patients that they saw, and whether or not, how many times was it relevant? That way you understand really how relevant that education program was to that audience. And then ultimately you ask them open-ended question as well. How did it impact their decisions? So when you intervene continuously after just doing a medical education program, not satisfying yourself with the thousands of attendees you get, but seeking to demonstrate teaching and learning, that's when you're able to demonstrate prescriptive analytics or changes in behavior, which leads to growth. In the world of publications now, let's look at another gap in metrics. Usually when you assess different types of publications, there is the phrase impact factor that comes up. Impact factor does not adjust for types of publications or types of citations, for example. It's merely based on the number of citations divided based on a benchmarks that are set in the last 2 years, for example. And so what I'm currently developing for Sourcero on behalf of Amadea Pharma for Sourcero is a publication clinical impact score, which describes the likelihood, the timeliness, and the relevance, the real world relevance of a particular publication along this continuum from basic research to real world evidence across this spectrum in order to guide and improve for future research or clinical decisions. So this publication clinical impact score consists of 5 different variables, which are the article type, the subject type, whether it's in humans, it's in animals, number of citations, but also the citation type and the recency, by rewarding those most recent types of publications because they're more likely to be relevant. And then it can be also divided into 3 different subscores. It's translational index, so numbers 1, article type, times number 2, subject type, times recency, reach, and translational index, reach, and recency. So ultimately, does it really tell us that a low score is meaningless? No. This type of score means that if a publication has a low score based on this metric, it may be more suitable for drug discovery, the drug discovery phase. It hasn't gotten enough attention. It hasn't gotten enough application yet, and it may be a longer time period until it's integrated into clinical practice. Whereas a medium or higher scores, which are all relative, are more likely to be integrated in the short term into clinical practice. So it's a translational score, which treats every publication individually, regardless of their author, regardless of how well published their author is, what their H index is, or other matters, which are, I believe, are more subjective. So the PCIS score essentially minimizes the numbers of factors in order to eliminate any subjectivity, in the score. And it also measures the ultimate reach of not just the citations, but what types of citation. Is it cited in a robust, really randomized clinical trial? In which case, it's factored and it's multiplied by a higher factor than another type of publication, like, for example, a case report, for example. And so it's imperfect. Every metric is imperfect. It's an estimate. That's why, again, a metric is an estimate of the relationship between the activity, publication in this case, and the desired outcomes. So you have received the attention, you've grabbed, the share of context, you're receiving feedback continuously, and now that the actual nature of why it is that somebody liked your post or your publication, for example, in a social media analogy, and you're receiving comments, but through the metrics that you've designed. Well, how do you then design a community? How do you then build a community? Well, it's when people share your content. It's when people reshare your content, then you then start to build a community, and you create those dialogues that matter. And that's the last part of the deep metrics approach, I think, that I'm going to spend a few minutes on, by building a featured continuous learning and development community. And one of the ways to do that is to really cross over those lines between the management and rank and file employees, between different functions, and decrease those intersections and coordinate them a little bit more. Make them simple. Make training simple to access. make it interactive, gamify it a little bit, right? When I had a training role, responsible for 9 medical affairs employees, 9 medical science liaisons, I had realized that in addition to all of the different metrics that we had, and that we were communicating all the time, we had lots of great resources that HR had, lots of great case studies, videos that we never really used. We had more resources than you could think of, but we weren't really utilizing them. And so, learning and development is really about reinforcing information and sharing it interactively as well, and having hands-on types of learning, right? And that's why we started to actually discuss these openly in a group format, and we created a community as a result, right? So the 3 components of a modern learning management system or learning and development program is simplicity, continuity, right, and community. Community through collaboration, engagement, and continuous quality improvement. Metrics is one area that I believe, similar to compliance training, code of conduct training, metrics requires a particular training program, a self-reflection of the engagement and the workflow that we create through those metrics as well, which were all interrelated, because the restrictions, right, the policies that we create, as well as that workflow based on have a direct influence on our metrics as well as the outcomes. And this is why I've created a 29-page medical affairs metrics workbook that's based on not only medical and pharma literature, but also beyond other industries. And that includes a lot of modern business management case studies from management literature, organizational change experts. And it includes a metric score as well, 10 questions, 50 points, 50 points maximum for an ideal metric score. And that allows you to assess how relevant are your metrics, and that includes various different types of parameters. These 10 parameters that are weighed differently based on their ultimate impact as well. And then finally, it includes these different perspectives, the 6 different perspectives or building blocks of metrics, as well as case studies and interactive types of content that you can use in order to improve and increase and create the contests that can redefine competition, really. So I'll close here with this last image, again, from the high jump competition, because if you may remember this moment from the Tokyo Olympics, at the conclusion of the high jump final, in which both Gianmarco Tamberi of Italy and Murtaz Barshim of Qatar were tied after clearing the 2 meters 39 centimeters. And they had made 3 attempts at the last height. They had they weren't able to clear any height above that. And the judge came up to them and he asked whether or not they wanted to pursue a tiebreaker in order to determine a clear winner of the gold medal. And in that moment, Murtaz Barshim looked at Gianmarco Tamberi for 1 second. And without even receiving a response, he then turned and looked back at the judge. And he asked, well, can we have 2 gold medals? And in that moment, as a big fan of competition, I was disappointed because I wanted to see a clear winner of the contest. But it wasn't until I read many different articles and I learned that both Murtaz Barshim and Gianmarco Tamberi had been training partners. The fact that they had both suffered critical injuries prior to major world competitions, and that they had apparently decided to to communicate a message of sportsmanship to the next generation of high jumpers and track and field athletes, that I realized that a different ending could not have been possible in this situation. Had it not been for the culture that they created, the norms of communication that they created amongst each other, amongst the two of them, this type of ending would not have been possible. And so I changed my mind in that instant after reading those articles and after researching this more. And so I also hope that many of you who are watching will be able to design the types of contests that matter in this very competitive environment, in order to redefine what competition is, and to advance from competition to collaboration and to innovation. Because at the end of the day, if we are able to measure something as subjective, as difficult to describe as pain, through clinical endpoints that are validated, if we're able to express something as abstract as music using notes and sheet music in order to replicate and improve our masterpieces and our performances over time, then I think that we in medical affairs, in pharma, in medical devices, can also design the types of key performance indicators and metrics that inspire and measure both performance and engagement, and that can redefine collaboration and competition for generations to come. Once again, thank you very much for your participation here. Because I was using a different platform, I'm not able to get to your comments here right now. However, what I'll leave you with is the title of the presentation with those thoughts. Please make sure to comment, ask questions, contact me, timmick@amadeapharma.com. I hope you found this valuable. And next time you'll hear from Amadea Pharma, next time you'll hear from me, I will share an unprecedented, a new event that will be organized by Amadea Pharma, that will demonstrate all of these concepts that I talked about, that reward sportsmanship as well as the scientific thinking in one event that all of you will be able to participate in. So a lot more to come, an important surprise. I think you will want to stay tuned and attend my next session coming up very soon. So connect with me, follow the Amadea Pharma page, email me, and have a great rest of the week, my friends. All the best.